welcome to Conversations with Dr. Joe, a talk show featuring both local personalities and guests from all over the country, coming to you right here on KBLF Radio 1490, serving Red Bluff, Corning, and all of Tehama County. Now here's your host, writer, editor, longtime clinical psychologist, and former Bay Area talk show host, Dr. Joseph Busey.
Remember all those signs that said U.S. out of the UN? I used to think they were just a bunch of kooks, but now I've come to believe they're right, for I've done a lot of reading and research, but not nearly so much as my guest today, Mr. John McManus, who's an officer in the John Birch Society, an organization that has been very successfully maligned by the liberal interest it exists to expose. This should be a very interesting show, especially since right now in former Yugoslavia, the drama is being played out. So stay tuned as I say, good morning, Tehama County, on this Saturday, June 3rd, 1995, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. Welcome to Conversations, a KBLF talk show featuring outspoken people from both here in Tehama County and from the uncivilized world outside. The show is called Conversations, and I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Busey. Our guest today is John McManus from back in benighted territory, what formerly used to be the locus of U.S. civilization, good old Boston, Massachusetts. I talked to him during the commercial, and he is squawking about that. He may have something to say about civilization when we get on. However, he's not on yet, and it's still my turn, so let me tell you a little bit about John McManus. He graduated in '57 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics from Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. At graduation, he received a commission as a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, and he served on active duty for 3 years. Then for 6 years thereafter, he was employed as an electronics engineer in New England. He joined the staff of the John Birch Society in 1966. In '73, he became the organization's Director of Public Relations and its Chief Media Representative throughout the United States. He has appeared on hundreds of radio shows and television programs, including C-SPAN and The Larry King Show. Also, in 1973, Mr. McManus began writing and syndicating a weekly newspaper column entitled The Birch Log. He has authored and produced numerous audiovisual programs and written extensively for John Birch Society-affiliated publications. His book, The Insiders, has gone through 4 editions. His most recent book, prior to this one we're talking about today, which is called Changing Commands, his most recent book was Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy, in which he explained how the economics problems facing our nation, he explained the economics problems facing our nations and how they can be solved. He is in wide demand as a speaker. Mr. McManus is the publisher of the New American Magazine, a bi-weekly journal of news and commentary, and in June 1991, he was named president of the John Birch Society. Today, he has been on all these other programs in preparation for this, the acme, the zenith, the pinnacle of his career, which is, of course, appearing on KBLF, KB Country, Radio 1490, out in Red Bluff, California. So with that, let me say, Mr. John McManus from Belmont, Massachusetts, near Boston, welcome to that part of the USA where good, beautiful, and intelligent people live, where the good, beautiful, and intelligent people live, right here in that hotbed of true civilization, pristine, bucolic, and dirt-poor Tehama County, California, where we have the biggest 2-day rodeo in the West, where all 3 of our parking meters still take pennies and you can't open your car doors against the world's highest curbs, where sheep outnumber cows who outnumber people, where the rattlesnakes are not the humankind, and where the spotted owl is more likely to appear on the menu than on the endangered species list. Mr. McManus, you say our enemies want to get us out. Let me see how I say this. You say our enemies want to put our armed forces under another command and thus relinquish U.S. sovereignty. Why on earth would anyone want to do that?
Well, the only people who would want to do that are the people who want a new world order, which is world government in their hands, socialism for everybody, which is slavery. And that's really what it's all about, this business of putting our military under a United Nations command, NATO command, which is part of the United Nations, really.
NATO is
going on for a long time.
NATO is part of the United Nations. Now, I never knew that.
Well, NATO is a regional arrangement under Articles the 50, 51, 52, I think it is, of the UN Charter. And everything that NATO does by the law of the UN has to be reported to the UN. NATO exists at the pleasure of the United Nations.
Okay, now everything has to be reported to the UN. Now, what is that? And I can never remember the actual position, but isn't there a place where they have a risky on the UN under the military?
At the founding of the United Nations, it was decided that the Undersecretary for Political and Security Council Affairs, the post that has all jurisdiction regarding disarmament, military affairs, and atomic energy, atomic weaponry, all that post should be in the hands of the Soviet Union. And for the entire duration of the United Nations since 1945, a Russian national, with one exception, a Yugoslav communist for a time, has held that post. The post is today held by a Russian, and they've subdivided it. Part of the world is now under the jurisdiction of an African. But the thing that has to be realized here is that all United Nations involvement of any kind in any military activity has been funneled through the communist who heads this post. That means that during the Korean War, when we served openly under United Nations command, that everything that was being done there was going through the UN, and our military people would say that our plans were obviously being given somehow to the other side. They knew what we were going to do before we did it, and this is a good place to go to find the treachery involved in that.
I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, it's like NATO was part of the UN. NATO existed to oppose the communist bloc, and the communist bloc was part of the UN and knowing those plans. I mean, it's like some sort of chess game where one guy's playing both sides.
Exactly, and it has been that way for a long, long time. The people who are on our side, so-called, the leaders of our nation, have been throwing the game. And they've thrown the game right from the beginning. It gets even worse than this. At the United Nations, there is a grouping that has military responsibilities, not the very one I've talked about, but another. And the chief official of that was another Russian. And early in 1950, he left the United Nations and went to North Korea to help plan the North Korean invasion of the South, which occurred in June of 1950. He gave the orders, he trained the troops, and so on. And then the Russians, the Soviet Union was absent during the decision to go into Korea to fight against this, and it was all because of some trumped-up reason. They could have vetoed it. They didn't. They stayed away. They were boycotting the UN at the time. It was looked upon by some as a great piece of luck. It wasn't luck. It had to be planned that way. And so we went in to fight the communists in North Korea under the United Nations when the United Nations officials were directing the other side of the war. Treachery of immense proportions. Our troops were not permitted to win the war, even though General MacArthur outfoxed them and did win the war, at least for a time, and then they removed him from his command. We fought against the Chinese communists, and we fought with one hand tied behind our back. And then the whole thing was repeated again in Vietnam. And this time it was SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, which is another regional arrangement under the United Nations, much the same as NATO.
Southeastern what?
Southeast Asia
Southeast
Treaty
Asia.
Organization. NATO being North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Well, you know, we get this stuff in the papers. I was thinking back as something in my introduction when I said I remember seeing the billboards, U.S. out of UN. And
No, you saw the billboard said, "Get us out," U.S., and there's kind of a pun there. Get us, United States, get us, the pronoun. Get us out of the United Nations is the slogan, yes.
Okay, well, I was reading it the other way, of course, back in my academic days, is back when I was in college and whatever, and I would see this, like back in North Carolina, and I think, oh, what a bunch of kooks. And, of course, I was running around with the people that Jesse Helms used to call the commies at Chapel Hill, who really were, actually. And I remember Bob Hope coming on the air and saying, well, the UN, some people are against the UN. I think it was Bob Hope of the UN, but, gee, what would we be without it? And, I mean, the propaganda was really great.
Well, the propaganda was great then, but it was even greater at the founding of the UN, 1945.
Well, why don't fill us in?
The United Nations, of course, was the planning for it was conducted all during World War II. And even before the war ended in June of 1945, the San Francisco Conference was held. It's the 50th anniversary of that coming up. The conference was headed, Secretary General of the founding conference was an American communist named Alger Hiss.
Oh, yes.
There were about 15 or 16 other top communists in our country who were great contributors to the formation of the United Nations. They weren't known as communists at the time, and neither was Hiss, but eventually it was shown conclusively that these individuals all were. So the communists wanted the UN, there's no doubt about that. They were helped along by 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the organization that the John Birch Society targets as the place to go to begin to find the conspiracy to destroy national sovereignty and the freedom of the people of this country. So that was the American delegation to the founding of the UN. Of course, the communists had their own delegation there, Andrei Gromyko leading the Soviets, Vyshinsky, and a bunch of... They were very anxious for it. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. He wanted the UN. It would bring about the world government that communists have always sought, and it would bring about the world government that the international socialists, people who supposedly were loyal Americans, wanted from this side.
Well, isn't that what communism has always been? Nazism was National Socialism, and communism was international socialism.
And a socialist is a socialist, isn't it? You know, people
Right.
sometimes say to me, well, what's the Birch Society doing these days now that communism is no longer around? And I said, well, USSR stood for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, didn't it? Oh, yeah. I said, well, when a communist decides to stop calling himself a communist and instead call himself a socialist, it's hardly time to run up the victory flag. And, of course, that's what's happened. And in practically all the countries of Eastern Europe that were formerly under the Soviet Union's heel, the leadership now are people who were only 3, 4, 5 years ago pronounced communists.
It's a miracle cure. They no longer have communism.
Well, I like to say communism is still alive in China, in Cuba, in North Vietnam, and North Korea,
And the U.S.
Berkeley, California,
Yeah, the
and
U.S.
Cambridge,
universities,
Massachusetts,
right.
and a lot of other campuses.
It's true. Well, why do you think so? Why do you think we have, like, for instance, like professors, etc., who get into that? Why are they communists? Or
Well, a lot of
socialists?
them.
Let's call them socialists.
Yeah, let's call them
not
socialists.
do
A lot of them have never left school. They did well in college. They went on to graduate school. They got a PhD, and they became a professor. And they've led a very sheltered life. Many of them are jealous of successful people in the free enterprise system who have earned greater salaries, have greater perks, and so forth, and they're still moving ahead on a professor's salary. They're jealous. They say the system
Which is not too
stinks.
bad, by the way.
Yeah, it's true. It's not that bad. But they have also never met a payroll. They've never gone out there and really risked their reputation and their future by starting a business and being a creator. They're thinkers. They themselves, many of them, are victims of the kind of instruction that they got. We are now seeing, as professors in the colleges, those who went through the terrible turmoil in the universities back in the 60s and 70s.
Well, let's not forget that academics can be lemmings, just like a lot of other people. They can follow. When I got to school, in graduate school, there was sort of an unspoken party line, and you knew how to say it, because if you said something different, you were sort of shunned and put out and, looked as, not quite able and willing and deserving.
Well, that's true. Political correctness is not something that started only a few years ago.
Oh, it's been going on for a long time.
Very much so. Only the term is new. And I have to confess that I was affected by much of this myself. Happily, I studied the sciences, and I didn't have to unlearn those. But many people that I know in the Birch Society have simply said they had to discard what they learned in college in economics or political science or some of the sociology business and so on, and just start over again. So that's what we recommend that people do. There are principles. The principles are not being taught. The principles are important. They will stay as principles, even if hardly anybody says them or adheres to them. And that's what we do in the Birch Society, is simply provide information to people so that they can have a better perspective on what's happening.
Well, I have two questions. One is, what are these principles? And two is, what is the Birch Society, and how did it come to be such a shibboleth if you will, to use a word we used last week of a program. How about that for a couple of words? I mean, it's a dirty word. Let's go with that. I mean,
well, let's first of all say let's mention some of the principles.
Alrighty.
The philosophical underpinnings of the United States of America are the principles that we uphold, and those are found in the Declaration of Independence. In your introductory remarks that I was listening to while you were stating them, you mentioned it. The philosophical base of our country is men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted.
And their Creator is with a capital C, and it's supernatural as God. It's not the state or the king or some people meeting in secret in places out east.
or west.
Or west.
So here we have, these are principles, and the principles are there is a God, we got our rights from God, and we who have our rights have established government for the purpose of protecting those rights and nothing more. Not for redistributing the wealth, not for taking control of people's lives, not for dominating their existence and so on. There are many other principles that we could discuss, but that's the foundation, and that's what the John Birch Society is very, very anxious to propagate, to get people to understand, to remind them of it, to insist that that be the case. Now, our country, when it started, had to fight a war with the British. We won. We sent them across the ocean. And then they came up with the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States is a correct reading of human nature. If government is not held in check, government is not limited, government will grow and become dominant and become tyrannical. And so the Constitution of the United States limits government to a very few areas. And if it were adhered to today, the federal government of the United States would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. Now, every one of the congressmen, senators, presidents, Supreme Court justices, and so on, they all take an oath to the Constitution of the United States. And then they put it in the bottom drawer and they go and do what they please. And we have ourselves to blame. We have allowed them to do this. People say to me, well, what would happen if the Constitution were fully enforced? I'd say, well, there would be no federal involvement in education, housing, transportation, health, welfare, agriculture, and so on.
Why not?
Because it's not there. It's not authorized in the Constitution. The very first article of the Constitution said, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in Congress. Herein granted. You can look through the Constitution of the United States. You will not find foreign aid, education, agriculture, and so on. It's just not there. Now, that does not mean that if the federal government is out of education, out of agriculture, out of housing, out of all these other things, that there wouldn't be any education or agriculture or housing and so forth. It's just that the federal government would not be involved.
How about foreign aid? Are you against foreign aid?
I am certainly against foreign aid. Taking money from the American people to give it to a foreign government, all foreign aid goes to governments.
I thought it all went to Swiss bank accounts.
No, well, it goes to foreign governments.
Right.
Some of the governments are headed by people who take the money and then put it in Swiss bank accounts, yes. But it doesn't go there directly.
Yeah, and I'm sure some is used probably halfway decently. But the principle you're saying is why should it be taken from someone?
Well, absolutely. It first of all, it's taking by force, and secondly, there's no authorization for it. There's no authorization in the Constitution for foreign aid. Now, if anybody feels that he wants to be helping some people in foreign lands, there's plenty of ways of doing it. And the best way, of course, would be to work through some sort of a religious group. But even beyond those, there are some secular groups that actually do help people. They do help people. They teach them how to farm. They teach them, they build schools for them. And those are all progress, and we certainly encourage that. But we just don't want governments involved in doing it.
Well, how about foundations doing it? I knew a guy that was working for probably one of your favorite foundations, the Ford Foundation, working in Africa on agricultural stuff.
Well, there's nothing wrong with the Ford Foundation doing that, but the Ford Foundation also does a lot of things that are very harmful. Yeah,
and I'm not sure if you're aware, there was a book that was recently published called Foundations, and I'm blocking on the guy's name that I've had on the show here several times.
William McElhenney?
No, he's a doctor from down in Santa Cruz, Stanley Monteith.
Oh, Stanley Monteith.
Yes.
He didn't. He just republished
Right, exactly.
that
He
book.
republished it, right.
Yeah, the book that you're talking about was written by Rene Wormser,
Right.
who was an official of the U.S. government
Reese Committee,
Congress investigating committee that went into investigating the subversion that was being accomplished by tax-exempt foundations way back in the 50s.
Because this is something that's still happening, and I would imagine, is this something the John Birch Society has been attacking or looking at?
Oh, yes. Yes, we're very, very strong proponents of people realizing what the Reese Committee was all about and how it was stymied as it was getting into exposing the conspiracy above communism. And that's important to realize, that communism is only a tool, always has been a tool of a larger conspiracy of people who themselves are not communists, using communism to scare people into wanting world government.
Okay, well, let me just first say that talking about conspiracies, that there is a conspiracy afoot by the government to make us identify ourselves at the top of the hour. We're a few minutes late. This is KB Radio, KBLF, Radio 1490 in Red Bluff, California. We've solved that government regulation there. Probably not a bad one, but another one of those little things that sort of irks you at times. But conspiracy theory, I mean, there's a lot of... a lot of stuff against it. I mean, it's not very popular to be a conspiracy theorist, and I have here an article written by Arlene Levinson, Associated Press writer, that appeared in our local paper called Self-Styled Patriots See Enemies Everywhere. They're talking about the Spotlight newspaper, and they're talking about all sorts of things, and it's really saying all these conspiracies. Social scientists and scholars of myths say these scary stories are invented and believed by people who need to explain their misfortunes and discomforts in life. And, I mean, they do everything to say that a conspiracy theory is the spoor of bovines. In other words, bull poopy.
Right. Well, let me say this, that I don't want to be in a position of having to defend the conspiracy attitudes of others. I will certainly defend the conspiracy attitude of the Birch Society. We don't call it a conspiracy theory, by the way. We call it a conspiracy fact.
Okay.
But let me also say this, that I won't prove conspiracy to you or to any of your listeners. People prove things to themselves. All I can do, all that I seek to do, is to provide evidence.
Put the information out there.
That's right. And the evidence that we present, we believe, is sufficient for reasonable people to arrive at that conclusion. What has happened over the years, and you touched on this a little while ago, is that the image of the John Birch Society has been so besmirched that most people won't even take a look at the evidence that we have. And they're doing themselves and their country and certainly their children and grandchildren a great disservice.
Well, yeah, let me just say right there that people who are listening should take a look at this evidence. If you want to poo-poo it after that, that's up to you. But
agreed.
The book here that I read for this is called Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military. We're going to get into that later on. We're setting groundwork for that right now. Copyright copyright 1995, just printed in March of 1995. This is hot off the presses. It's, not that all expensive. How expensive is it?
$8.95 plus $2 for postage and handling. Let me give an 800 number.
Please do.
First of all, we encourage people to order a $5 packet of information from us. That includes a sample of our biweekly magazine, The New American, lots of pamphlets, even one pamphlet about how the John Birch Society's name was dragged through the mud and why and who did it and how unfair it was. That $5 packet plus my book, which is $8.95 plus $2 for postage and handling, all of it or part of it could be had by simply 800 number 1-800-JBS for John Birch Society, 1-800-JBS-USA-1. Operators would be happy to take your order for the $5 packet or for the book at $10.95 or for both.
Okay, and I think it's worthwhile. Even if you're on the other side, it's worthwhile. If you're on the other side, you ought to read it. Just like those of us who tend to be on the conservative side, one of the things I read is Progressive Magazine. Like I say, once in a while they have a good idea there. Sometimes, actually, there's interesting sometimes what's called the far left and the far right, and it's not really the far left and far right, but it gets labeled that way. actually can join forces in some of these conspiracy theories.
Well, the anti-establishment element of the left and the right is sometimes in parallel.
Okay, nice way of saying it.
The solution to the problem, however, is the right usually wants less government. The left wants to have the right people run the government.
More government by the right people, which, of course, is me.
This is you.
Well, me and you, and I'm not so sure about you because.
Well, you know, I don't want power. I want government power taken away from it. I want government back under the Constitution, which is very limited power.
Right, but you missed me there because what I'm doing again is using my self-sarcasm because that's what most people think. Well, if only I were in charge, then I would be the benevolent dictator.
I think you'd make a better emperor.
Yeah, right. And then, of course, the thing is, once you get in power, all you have to do is look what you might do with your own children and some other things. I remember getting in a minor university position and starting writing memos. And the more I got into writing those memos, I'm sure the more oligarchic I started sounding. It's so easy to do.
Oh, yeah. Power corrupts.
Right. That's Lord Acton's principle, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. We'll talk more then about the John Birch Society. Actually, how did it come into being? And okay, I know what it was. People were, and there was, you said you even have a pamphlet about that, about how people try to put it down, which reminds me of like when the people go in San Francisco to the Bohemian Grove, all the leaders go out there to cavort around and whatever. Their great columnist Herb Cain there would always make fun of people saying it's a conspiracy. By making fun of it, you defuse the whole idea behind it.
Exactly. Well, the John Birch Society was born in December of 1958. A man named Robert Welsh, who lived in Belmont, Massachusetts, gathered 11 friends, talked to them for 2 full days at a meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana, and outlined his thinking about what was happening in the world and what could be done about it. And they agreed with him and said, let's form the organization you've outlined here. If you had to describe the Birch Society in 2 words, you'd say information agency. We seek to bring information to the American people that is available to everyone but is not given them with their normal sources. People tend to rely on radio, television, magazines, newspapers. And the information that we think they need is being kept from them, although it is available if they do their own digging. And so what we decided to do was to be the diggers and to put it out in pamphlets, books, videotapes, the magazine, and so on. And we have had quite an impact, so much so that forces whom we were exposing began to target us for smear campaigns. We were labeled every nasty adjective you could imagine: racist, anti-Semitic, crackpot, kook, like the Klan, like the communists, like the Nazis, all of it. None of which had any substance.
But most people don't know that. They just hear that because, again, they're getting their information from places where and they're not very discriminating about, where they get it or what they know about it.
That's true.
Discerning is a better word. They're not really discerning. I think most people don't discern what the national media is all about. I mean, to give you an idea, there's in this area, a conservative commentator has a talk show who was praising, in a sense, Walter Cronkite as being the man America's trusted way back when, and things have changed. And I had to tell him, look, Uncle Walter, as we used to call him, was really for unilateral disarmament. Uncle Walter was very much a very closet super-liberal.
Exactly.
People didn't know it.
Well, there were articles in our magazine back during that period to show people what Walter Cronkite really stood for. I mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations a little while ago, an organization formed in 1921 to bring about world government and to destroy the independence of our nation. This organization today, with 3,600 members, can claim as its members the leaders of all organs of the popular media: ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, National Review, a whole bunch of... So people tend to say, well, I get my information from reputable sources, and indeed they are reputable because they are given that status by other people who are part and parcel of the same cabal. The John Birch Society is different. We promote information, we dispense information that people say to themselves when they look at it, how come I never heard this before? And then they are in a position to know that they have been, I guess we could say, snookered. I can remember deciding that myself back in the early 1960s, and I got angry about it. I said, I'm not going to let this happen to me again. I stumbled into the John Birch Society. I spent quite a bit of time examining it to make sure I wasn't getting into something that was disreputable, and it wasn't. So I joined the society, and I like to say if you hang around long enough, sometimes they make you president.
Okay, I was thinking two things. One, because I give money to the John Birch Society, usually because of the shame of having giving money to the ACLU for so long, because that's what you did when you were in college and graduate school. It's my guilt payment. Actually, no, I like the principles of what they stand for. And by the way, if anyone wants to, I bought 100 of the magazine, the New American, their special United Nations issue. I thought it was so important to read and to look at. If any listener wants to get it, I will sell it to you. How's this? The thing cost me $2.50. I'll sell it to you for $2, including the postage. All you have to do is give me a call and send me the $2, and I will send this to you so you can see for yourself what it is. I thought it was important. I am passing them out to certain people. But I was just thinking, Mr. McManus, the word conspiracy, of course, it means to breathe together.
Exactly.
And it doesn't necessarily have to mean, in my mind, and you correct me as you see fit here, of course, that we have these 37 or 3,500 people in the Council on Foreign Relations, out of which a trilateral commission, or the trilateral, whatever it's called, is pulled. People who are really running things, I'm not sure they all get together and say, this is the way we want to do it, and we're going to conspire to get power for ourselves.
That's right, they don't.
They just, if you breathe together, if you say you're sleeping with your wife, hopefully, you might find that breathing patterns, or when you're in a room with people, breathing patterns tend to even out together, and without even knowing it, you're breathing in harmony with someone else.
Well, body language, too.
Right. And pretty soon, you're changing, and you're all becoming in tune with each other. And these people, in my way of thinking, and now Chuck Carter of For the People, which his radio station carries his programs, and I don't know if you know who he is. If you haven't, you should listen to him sometime. I know the Nation magazine, which is about as far left as you can get, came out with a vicious smear against him, so that means he's got to be pretty good. He talked about, the CFR just being a country club. Well, maybe
it's more than that.
It may be true, but a country club is also where the deals are made. And
part of the bylaws of this country club are that anybody who talks about what goes on at their meetings, that's grounds for expulsion. So that's not a country club. Let me try to explain in a few words here how it works.
Please do, and take more than a few words.
All right. Well, first of all, the word conspiracy has three elements, a conspiracy. It's more than one person, it's secret, and it's evil. If it's more than one person and secret, it's not necessarily evil, and therefore there are people who have commented on what we're talking about here and said that this is a good thing, and therefore they never use the word conspiracy. That being Carol Quigley, President Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University. But what we're talking about is evil. We're talking about destroying the sovereignty of nations, especially our own, and leading mankind into slavery. And that's what we believe is in the cards unless this thing is exposed. Now, a conspiracy can operate with only very few people actually committed to the evil, and many, many others committed to self, and it's made opportune for them to promote the goals of the conspiracy by simply carrying out its will, its message, its programs, and so on. And that's the way it works. Of the 3,600 people in the Council on Foreign Relations, I would say 10% or fewer are knowing, willing destroyers. The rest are self-servers who say to themselves, carrying the ball for these people is going to get me ahead.
Or I've arrived because I'm part of this group. You know, sure. Lenin talked about youthful idiots, and we were talking about the intelligentsia and the academia and the cognoscenti and all those sorts of people before, and it always comes to my mind, I think it's George Bernard Shaw, who went to Russia during the time of the pogroms, or actually the people before, and it always comes to my mind, I think it's George Bernard Shaw, who went to Russia during the time of the pogroms, or actually the what were they called, the liquidations, the purges, and came back and said, I have seen the future and it works. I mean, what an idiot. He was one of the most famous writers in England. He was an idiot. He couldn't see beyond his own nose or beyond his own ego.
Well, he was also a founder of the Fabian Socialist movement in England, and I think he knew what he was doing. I don't think he was ignorant. I think he was heavily into deciding that the world would be better off run by him and his colleagues, and if it meant that they would do it over the corpses of millions, that's okay, too.
Right.
So I have a very dim view of Mr. Shaw. But the conspiracy that we're talking about here, you mentioned Lenin. Lenin one time said, communism must be built with non-communist hands. And you could translate that and say the conspiracy that we're talking about here must be built with non-conspiratorial hands, self-promoters. If we make it opportune for people to sell out their country and to sell out their fellow man, there are people who will do it. And that's human nature.
Well, one of the things I tell people when they say, oh, you know, if you believe in any sort of conspiracy theory, you're an idiot, I say two things. First of all, if you're a Christian, and if you believe the type of Christian who believes in a Bible, which I think is about the only type of Christian, though there's some new types coming out who make their own Bibles, you have to believe in conspiracy theory because Christianity is conspiracy theory. Now, that's a little theological, but it's a conspiracy theory in terms of eschatology. But I say, what is it that these people have in common? Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Lenin, as they say. All these other people they have in common. They all wanted to rule the world. Now, why, if they wanted to rule the world back then, why should we think that there aren't people right now who think...
Well, some of those people you've named did it openly.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And therefore it wasn't a conspiracy. But my attitude is that if you ignore conspiracy, you have to rewrite history. It reeks with it. And your point is a very good one. There are people in all ages who believe that they should rule the world. And I don't, and you don't, and your listeners don't, and therefore they tend to discount that there are such people. And yet if you talk about this kind of thing that happened 300 years ago or more, they'll say, oh yeah, things like that could have happened way back then.
Yeah, but
why not today?
We're changed, we're evolved, or whatever.
Oh yeah, we're in much better shape today. We're far more educated people. That's not so.
We may be far more educated in certain ways, but in certain terms of values and human nature, that hasn't changed a bit.
Well, we've got a lot more people going to school. That doesn't mean they're educated.
We've also, this is the bloodiest century that there's ever been in terms of actual numbers and percentages.
Exactly.
Tell you what, we need to take a break to get some commercial messages on here. When we come back, let's get this conversation back more towards the UN and changing commands, the betrayal of America's military, especially with what's happening now in Yugoslavia. So that will give you, John McManus, a little bit to think and organize during the next several minutes when we have these commercial messages. And this is KB Country, KBLF, Radio 1490, the voice of Tehama County. The show is called Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Busey, and today we're talking with John McManus, who is president of the John Birch Society, and has written a book called Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military. And in regard to what's happening in Yugoslavia right now and the UN and whatever, this is all big news. It almost looks like the UN is being, they're not doing too well in Yugoslavia, and whether is this, I wonder if this plan, I wonder if the plane supposedly blew up the other day, whether this is going to be that the U.S. will get involved. What do you think's going on there, and why?
Well, I think what's going on is that centuries-old disputes among Croats, Serbians, Muslims under that, what is formerly Yugoslavia, are again inflamed, and the people of our nation are being conditioned that it's our fight, that we have to get in there and we have to settle it.
By the way, just let me say, of all places, in the New Yorker magazine, either this week or last week, there was a very good article I thought was well-balanced on Yugoslavia and all the things going on there.
New Yorker or New York?
New Yorker magazine.
New Yorker.
Not necessarily known as a conservative magazine.
Oh, let's take a look at that. Well, what's happening, of course, is that the United States is becoming the United Nations Globocop.
Uh-huh.
And we don't want that. We in the John Birch Society don't want it. I don't think the American people want it. And yet we're being conditioned all the time to accept that role. Now, the situation that we're in today, of course, goes back many years, the genesis of it. if we go back and realize that the Constitution of the United States very clearly says Congress and Congress alone shall declare war, the war-making power is given to Congress, not to the President, not to anybody but Congress. And everybody would know that we didn't have any declaration of war in Korea. We didn't have any declaration of war in Vietnam.
But they called it a police action or something else, and therefore it's not a war. I mean, talk about it. That's like a 5-year-old explaining he wasn't in the cookie jar. He was in the jar where there was
cookies.
Well, no, something he'd have to say whether there was dough that was baked, but there were not cookies.
Yeah. Well, we also went to war in Desert Storm in Iraq, and there was no declaration there. Each of these was done with United Nations support. The latest being the war in Iraq. Mr. Bush went to the UN, asked for a resolution from the United Nations to conduct a war. Congress idly let him do it. He then started the war. Just prior to starting the war, 2 senators went to the Middle East to visit the troops, came home and begged Mr. Bush not to start the war. The 2 senators, Mitchell of Maine and Simon of Illinois, neither of whom ever took a vote in the Senate that I agreed with, but nevertheless, they came back and they begged the president not to start the war. They said there's going to be blood all over the desert. And George Bush told them, and Paul Simon, Senator Simon from Illinois, put it in the congressional record. He told them, if we use the military, we can build the United Nations. And that's what the war in Desert Storm was all about. There are people who will say it was about oil. There are people who would say it's about a tyrannical ruler named Saddam Hussein. People who will say all kinds of things. But George Bush, the man who arranged it, said that its purpose was to build the United Nations, and he succeeded in that role. He then went to the United Nations, and he said he would like to see the United Nations role expanded to involve the UN in domestic matters within the borders of nations, even to change a nation's leader. And that's a violation even of the United Nations Charter, which is very clear on that subject. Nothing in the Charter of the UN says, Article 2, Section 7, nothing in this charter provides the UN with any authority to have anything to say about what goes on within the borders of nations. And if that had not been there, our nation and most other nations would never have signed on to the UN Charter in 1945 or afterwards.
But somehow that's been changed.
Somehow that's been changed, and it got changed, and so now we send troops into Somalia on a humanitarian mission, which is not our military's role, and then their mission gets changed to disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. What a precedent there. Then we send them into Haiti, and their mission there is to disarm the civilian population and change the nation's leader. And the precedents that have been established over the years are being acted upon.
Well, disarm the civilian population. Do you think that the UN would like to see the civilian population of the United States disarmed?
Exactly. And I think that the leaders of our nation are people who would very much like to see that happen. That's the problem. See, the problem isn't as much the United Nations as the leadership of our nation consistently over many, many years pro-UN to the point of having the UN take over responsibilities and have the UN eventually be in a position to seize control of the entire world.
And, of course, these leaders would have favored places in this ruling elite.
Well, they already are. George Bush and Bill Clinton came out of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Ronald Reagan didn't, but he surrounded himself with people, all of his cabinet officials, or most of them, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Well, what we would have would be we would have a worldwide nomenclatura, however it's pronounced.
Nomenclatura, yes.
Oh, it's a Russian word, those are the people, that's like nomenclature. Those are the people on the list, right? That the 1% of Russians who
can shop in the very nice stores, who don't have to worry about any needs personally, and who are themselves criminals.
The ruling elite, so therefore we would have a ruling elite of the world, and the rest of us would be down here, everyone would be level, except for some animals would be more equal than others. Let's go for a moment now to a combat arms survey, because your introduction to this book called Changing Commands, and by the way, you get a packet called 1-800-JBS-USA-1, and for those of you who, like me, have a hard time doing that, I will translate that into numbers later on for you. But in the meantime, 1-800-JBS-USA-1, you get a packet for about,
a $5 packet or a $10.95 book.
Well, I'd say $15 to $20 is worth your while to pay for it and see. But you start your whole book with a combat arms survey. I've heard about this too, and then you're really saying it really actually did happen.
Yes, it did.
Would you tell us about that?
In May of 1994, just a year ago, a couple of hundred Marines at the 29 Palms base in Southern California were herded into an amphitheater and were forced to participate in a survey given by a Navy lieutenant commander named Guy Cunningham. The survey had 46 questions, and most of them were, do you agree or disagree or have no opinion? It started off by saying, would you serve under the United Nations command? Would you be willing to take orders from the United Nations? Would you be willing to have the President of the United States transfer his commander-in-chief responsibilities to the United Nations, and so on? It ended up with an oath. I am a United Nations fighting person. I am willing to spend my life for the United Nations, and so forth. And then the last question said, consider the following scenario. The U.S. government declares a ban on the private ownership of firearms, a 30-day amnesty period. At the end of the 30 days, some citizens and groups decide not to turn over their arms. What do you think of the following statement? I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse to turn over their arms to the United States government. Do you agree or do you disagree or do you have no opinion? Now, what happened is that the Marines who took that generally were outraged. And we know that because one of the Marines was not himself a member of the Birch Society, but had read several of our books and had relatives within the society. And he came out after it was over, and he was grousing to some of his fellow Marines, and one of them said, well, would you like a copy of that? He said, I sure would. He said, well, they gave me two, and I brought one out here. And so the young Marines sent it to us immediately, and that's how we know about it, and we started publicizing it in our magazine. Well, then the Navy and the Marine Corps both began to say, look, this was just a term paper by a Navy lieutenant commander who was studying at the Monterey Postgraduate School there in California. And they tended to brush it off with that.
And that poor guy's career has probably been ruined now.
No, it hasn't. No, not at all. But that misses the point completely.
No, I agree with that.
The point is that the senior officers of the Marine Corps allowed that subversive type thinking to be implanted in the minds of the young Marines.
Exactly. Even if you don't agree with it, you start thinking about it.
Exactly. Now, I served as a Marine Corps officer, and if I'd stayed in the service, I could very well have risen to a rank where I'm the head of a post. And if somebody had come to me and asked if he could survey my troops, I would say, well, what do you want to survey? What's your survey all about? And if he showed me this particular survey, I would have shown him the gate. But that didn't happen. Now, the young Marine who sent it to us also sent, when he sent the survey to us, he sent us a copy of an article out of the base newspaper. And it was an article about the fact that a delegation from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City had recently visited the post and were shown all around the place by the generals and the colonels, and wasn't this wonderful? Now, why would senior officers of the Marine Corps allow a survey like this? Why would they allow the Council on Foreign Relations to come? Well, the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, General Mundy, was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the same can be said for the top officers of the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. Even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in recent years has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's not just media and government and foundations and banking and international corporations. It's also the military.
Their tentacles are in all the important institutions of the country.
And there's only 3,600 of them. And it's an incredible story. So I have an entire chapter in my book about how the Council on Foreign Relations has moved into and taken over the military. We've recently heard about this book written by Robert McNamara. In Retrospect is his book, where he comes out and he says that it was all a mistake, that Vietnam, the whole thing, was a mistake. And it wasn't a mistake at all. Robert McNamara should be arrested and tried for treason, even before his book came out. But what his book does is admit a smaller sin to cover up a much larger sin. And that much larger sin was deliberate destruction of the military in the United States, the division of our people, the bankrupting of our federal treasury, the turning over of a whole area in Southeast Asia to communist brutality. All of that occurred as a result of the war in Vietnam, And it was planned that way in our view. And Robert McNamara himself, a member of this Council on Foreign Relations all during that period, along with Dean Rusk, it all focuses back to the same source. And as James Forrestal once said, if they were all mistakes, they would have made a few in our favor.
You know, it reminds me, too, of the PBS had the 13-week series on Vietnam, and Reed Irvine from Accuracy in Media finally was able, after he screamed and yelled, to get 1 hour of comeback to that program. And after, of course, his 1 hour of comeback, they had many panels discussing him one way or the other. But there was a 13-week, just totally one way, I was going to say one world, and it probably is, one way of biased view of it.
Yes.
You're hearing, I know a young girl in the high school here who said her history teacher was talking about how bad Vietnam was, and I said, did he ever give any of the other side? She said, no. You know, and that's not to put down this high school, that's just the way it goes. People either don't know the other side or they're unwilling to give it.
Well, that's true. In most cases, they don't know the other side. What needs to be said about Vietnam is our men were told to shoot, but not till they were shot at. They were told not to chase the enemy across the borders. They were told not to go into strategic targets. They were told the pilots not to attack the ships on the way to Haiphong Harbor. They were told not to attack a SAM missile site as it was being constructed, but that they could try once it was operational. It was an incredible amount. And this was McNamara, these rules of engagement, McNamara and Rusk and all of these Council on Foreign Relations people. Now, all during the war in Vietnam as well, our government was supplying both sides. Tremendous quantities of aid and trade, money, equipment, everything going to Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all of the communist nations in Europe, and then transshipping it right to North Vietnam to kill Americans. You talk about treachery, treason, behind-the-scenes double-dealing and so on. It was immense. And at the end of the war in Vietnam, then they left so many of the POWs behind. I've got a chapter on that in my book, and it's an incredible story of treachery there.
And you think, you know, how our brains and our psyches are being tenderized and sort of like a meat pounder, pounding them to accept these sorts of things so that now we really accept the fact that, gee, it's okay to have U.S. troops under UN command. And that somehow, and I guess this is what blows my mind, to use the old cliche, is why people think that the UN is going to be anywhere near like the values that they have for themselves today.
Well, it certainly does not. You know, there's one good way of looking at the UN. You can bring it down to a microcosm.
What's that? To the sights of your gun?
Well, yeah, that's one way. No, I mean one instructive way of looking at the UN.
Not destructive, okay.
Let's suppose you live in a small subdivision of your community, and there's 30 families, and 2 of them are at each other's throats, and they're constantly bickering and fighting. Now, will it help or hurt the situation if somebody comes in and says all 30 families have to choose sides? You have to pick a side. You have to decide that you're on the side of one family or the other family. And, of course, if you do that, then it becomes far worse. Now, that's exactly what you've got going on in the international community. You've got Croats and Serbians and Muslims at each other's throats. They've been at it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now everybody has to take a side. We have to pick. Do we support the Croats or the Muslims? Do we inject ourselves in it in the name of peace? Of course, you would have to side with one side or the other, or it would be perceived that way by one of the sides or both of the sides. And so everybody has to decide. So the United Nations is now involved. That means Portugal has to have an opinion on this, and Indonesia does, and Sri Lanka does. The Seychelles Islands have to have a position on this. So does Chile and Mexico and the United States and everybody. And therefore the problem is much, much worse. And what we should say simply is this. What these people are doing to each other is so horrible and so wrong and so bad that eventually they'll see it and they'll stop. And that's the only way it can be solved. And people who say, no, it can be solved, the United Nations can go in there and the United Nations can enforce peace. That is the great oxymoron of our day.
Enforce peace.
Enforce peace. And the United Nations talks about a UN peace force. And there's the oxymoron. If it's force, it's not peace.
Okay, and I think what I was alluding to earlier is that the value system that is taken over the UN is really a value system of not only a new world order, but a new world values, if you will. It is not a Christian value system. It is not a Orthodox or religious Judaic value system. It's certainly not a Orthodox Muslim value system. It's a very humanistic, secular humanistic value system.
Exactly. Well, go back to the founding of the United States, as I alluded to before. We see men are endowed by their Creator, and the men who have rights from the Creator use their powers, their rights, to establish governments to protect their rights. So things are in proper order. God's on top, individuals next with their rights, and down at the bottom you have governments formed merely and solely to protect their rights. Now go to the UN. The UN, first of all, is no God. No God at the UN, never has been.
Well, they don't want competition.
Right. Secondly, you have the Covenant on International Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, And what does it say? It says, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, except if we pass a law that says you don't.
Yeah, but they word it in a slightly different way.
That's
the
substantially what they say.
Yeah, right.
The rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carry special duties and responsibilities and may therefore be subject to certain laws, certain regulations as prescribed by law.
Right, that's the euphemism. What they're really saying is we can change it at any time.
Right, and the U.S. system, what does it say? Article 1 of the Bill of Rights, First Amendment. Congress shall make no law because the rights of speech, press, assembly, religion transcend any power of government, and government at the national level shall have nothing to say about them. That's the American system.
So we have in the UN is really an attempt to set up a kingdom where the king or his minions, at their will, can change the laws and their whims.
That's right, and it's completely upside down. The United States is God on top, individuals next, governments on the bottom. The United Nations is government on top, individuals next, and no God.
That reminds me of the motto of the John Birch Society. What is it? Less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.
Very well done. Yes, exactly.
Okay. And I was thinking, even like something came out. I've been every once in a while I make little jabs on this show about it. I think there is going to be a conference on women in China.
Lovely place for it.
Right. Well, of course, I think because China has their own problems with women, they're trying to put the women at a hotel out somewhere. But that wasn't even my point. My point was Phyllis Schlafly, who at last count was a woman, wanted to go, and some people like that, they wouldn't let them because you have to be the right kind of woman to go. You have to be the new thinking type of woman, which means a gender feminist to go. I mean, and you're going to find this on religion. You're going to find this on everything that I think most people in this country would find that a UN that would be composed of the Hillary Clintons and the Jane Fondas. I mean, these are the people we've sent there who are active in it.
Bella Abzug.
Yep. And the guy from Canada that did the Rainforest Conference in Rio. What's his name?
Maurice Strong.
Maurice Strong. The other guy that has been in.
Send Al Gore.
Yep. Education for so long. I don't remember these names that well, but there's so many people that if you read what they stand for, and these are the leaders, you wouldn't want your kids going to school under them or with their kids because they have a value system that is entirely different than ours.
And that value system is throughout the American educational system today.
Well, that's where we're fighting, and you're right, exactly.
That's one of the great tragedies of our time is federal involvement in education and tremendous amounts of money, and all of the money that has been put into it has guaranteed that the quality has gone down.
Well, if we have 1 million religious people and one happens to be an atheist, that poor atheist's heart would be broken if there was a prayer in school.
Well, the only answer to that is the American way, and the American way says very simply, the people who want prayer in the schools ought to have theirs, the people who don't want prayer in the schools ought to have theirs, and nobody should be forced to pay for somebody else's idea of education. That is the American way.
So how would you,
not being practiced.
How would you do that? Would you have prayer in school or not?
Would I?
Yeah.
Well, I would have government out of it, and I would therefore get together with friends who are of a like mind, and we would finance our own school. And yes, my particular school, my preference would be that if you're going to educate somebody and leave out God, that you're not, then you're miseducating. But that's my preference.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't ask anybody to pay for my kind of school. And if somebody 2 blocks away wanted to have a school where there was no God, that was completely secular, that's his choice. This is America. And let the best attitude win. Let's have competition instead of government monopoly over the schools and forcing everybody to pay for a system that everybody knows is terribly deficient.
And let's see what those schools would look like after a while, and how many kids would want to send their parents would want to send their kids to the God school, and how many would want to send to the no God.
That's
school.
right. Let people choose.
We can see what the no God schools are happening these days.
But not only let them choose which school, let them choose which school to finance. Compulsory taxation to support this governmental system is a little bit of tyranny.
Just a little bit. And speaking of a little bit, we're going to have to pause again for our final commercial break. We are talking with John McManus, who wrote a very interesting book I think you ought to get. It's called Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military. We haven't even gone into, and we could speak another hour, things like homosexuals in the military, women in the military, the cover-up behind the flyer that just, Holt Green, I think it was, that just got killed in an accident. It goes on and on and on, but you can get this. There's a packet, $5 packet, and the book is about $9, maybe $11 or so, about $13, $14, $15. You call 1-800-JBS-USA1, or I've translated for those of us who don't like the letters on the phone, 800-527-8721. And you wouldn't know this, Mr. McManus, but out here 527 is our local prefix, so it sounds like you're calling right here locally. But I don't know who 527-8721 is in town here. It might be someone who's a flaming liberal.
Well, it's got to be 800 before it if
right.
You're going to get our book.
800-527-8721. We'll be back in a moment after these free market, free enterprise commercial messages. This is KB Country, KBLF, Radio 1490, the voice of Tehama County. The show is called Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Busey, talking today with John McManus, who's president of the John Birch Society, editor of the New American Magazine, which is a great magazine. If you haven't seen it, you ought to see it. By the way, I have a whole bunch of the special United Nations issues. They go for $2.50. I'll sell them to you for $2. That includes postage. All you have to do is call me. I'm right in the phone book under psychologists or marriage counselors, or you can get my number from the station here. I'll be glad to get it to you. I think more people, even if you're a flaming left-wing liberal, you ought to read it. It might change your mind a little bit. But we were talking, and we just have a few minutes left, but with Mr. McManus about his book, Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, which, by the way, you can get 1-800-527-8721 or 1-800-JBS, John Birch Society, USA 1, for about $5 plus $8 for the book. About $15 you can get a very interesting package. Let's go in the last few minutes, John, with, again, on the military, and this whole idea, I guess, is to defang our military or else to make our military under another command. Then we don't have a rock to hide in, do we?
Then we can't defend ourselves. That's right. Well, it is so bad, and it's sometimes hard to believe. In 1961, President John Kennedy went to the United Nations, and he presented the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, a 3-stage disarmament program that would lead to the United States turning over its military to the United Nations. That was in 1961. Many of the interim steps in the program have already been accomplished. Only recently, I checked again with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in Washington and asked if this program is still in force and is still the policy of the government of the United States. And the answer was, oh, yes, and much of it has already been accomplished. Now, the program ends up, and I quote, and it says, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Now, ladies and gentlemen listening, I'm not making it up. I wish I were sometimes. What I'm saying is that the fixed and determined policy of the government of the United States since 1961 has been to incrementally turn over our military to the United Nations. Many of the things that have happened in recent years are part of the program. It is unfolding, and it has to be stopped. Now, the book that we've talked about, Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, has discussion about this program and many other things. And the entire government program from 1961 is published as an appendix in my book. It's there. You can read it yourself, and then you will be better armed and better able to help us to stop the treachery.
Because I would like to see, like the next elections, whatever a congressman or senator, what comes up, I would like this question loud and clear. Do you believe that the U.S. should turn over its forces to United Nations command? And I want that man or woman to be on record for what they would do.
I agree. I agree. And the more people in our country that would do that, the better. Dr. Joseph Busey, let me thank you very much for the time on the air here. I think that talk radio and interview shows such as yours are the best example of a free press left in the United States of America. I salute you for doing what you're doing. The people involved in talk radio across the country, most of them highly responsible, are indeed supplying information to the American people that they don't get in their normal sources.
Boy, and the government and and I'm going to stretch this out. We've got a couple more minutes left here. You're giving me my accolades too quick, sir. I'm going to give you yours. But the government sure doesn't like that, do they?
No, it doesn't. And they would like to be able to silence it in the aftermath of the horror in Oklahoma City. We have heard attacks on what is called hate radio. It's not hate radio. And what the president and a lot of the establishment are trying to accomplish is to squelch dissent from policies which are harming our nation.
Well, because after all, the elite have been running things so long. The great thing about talk radio and about little newsletters, I think newsletters even preceded talk radio. There's I got into this.
They haven't had the effect, though. The talk radio is much more effective.
I think they paved the way, though.
Yes,
in fact, I mean, and this has happened, and the scary part is this often happens when there's more totalitarian control from the top. The people sort of have to squeak out underneath. You're squashing them. They sort of squeak out under the sides of this big block you're squashing them with, because this is what happened. What's it called? The samizdat in Russia?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it? The underground press, so to speak, that would come out because it's not the party line.
That's right. Well, it's not underground in our country. We still do have a lot of our freedoms. We can get back some lost freedoms. Part of that would be an end to much of the taxation, regulations, controls, and bureaucracy that we've been saddled with.
You wouldn't believe.
That, of course, has to be done as well. So we ask people to take a look at the Birch Society. You've heard about it. You've maybe been given an attitude that you should stay away from it. All we can say is you owe it to yourself to take a look.
Well, keep your mind open. If just take a look and see what it says.
Exactly.
Don't go on what someone else says. And by the way, again, the number is 1-800-JBS-USA1 or 1-800-527-8721. You can get for about $15, you can get an introductory packet, plus this book called Changing Commands, which I heartily and very heartily, 3 times there, recommend. Thank you, Mr. McManus, and we hope to have you on again sometime.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I thank you very much, and good luck to California.